Hey folks, welcome back to Wandering into Wellness.
Hello.
Finn and Lydia, your usual familiars. And in between us we have our fave, like you might remember from last year where we talked a little bit about ketosis, we talked about like diabetes a little bit, but today we're here to talk about, with Robert Verkerk, the issue of
meat eating,
yes,
both for the planet, looking at the environment, but also for health. And where are we with this, and particularly what's happening with the vegan trend?
So controversial topic. You know, everybody's seen all of the films that have come out in the last like 2 or 3 years that are like really pushing the vegan agenda as being scientifically, evidentially the best thing for the planet. You don't agree?
I don't agree. I don't think it's going to happen, and I think if we do move in that direction, there's some really important things we need to be thinking about that could go wrong. And I think everyone knows that there's something dramatically wrong with the way in which we produce food. I think moving to vegan diets globally is not part of the solution, and that's because we actually need animals in the system. And we also need to understand some of the differences between animals and plants and look at the system. So I'm coming at this as an ecologist. I'm also someone that's been very much involved in the politics of healthcare and agriculture. I'm also very interested in human nature, and there is a very strong link between prosperity and meat eating. And we're also at a point in time in our evolution where the public doesn't take well to kind of top-down solutions. So
Yes.
This top-down solution is coming from a limited set of data that gives us a view that there is a problem. We are seeing certainly an issue around carbon emissions in agriculture. Does veganism solve the problem? I think not.
Okay, so speak to that a little bit. So why do we need animals, and why are we being told that you're saying we need animals for the health of the planet, but why are we being told then that actually our meat is what's causing the health of the planet to have an issue with carbon emissions?
Quite simply, if you take all of the data on global emissions from agriculture and put them in a melding pot and try and come up with a solution, things don't look good. But when you start breaking down what's happening in different subsets, you'll see that that is an irrational way of doing it. So, 24%, if you look at IPCC data, 24% of carbon emissions are coming from our agriculture. Most of that is coming from industrial farming systems. It's not coming from agroecological systems. You talk to anyone within...
What's an industrial farming system? What's an agroecological system? I think that's where you're going to go there.
Yeah. What is the difference between an industrial farming system and an
ecological system?
Yeah, an industrial farming system is basically where you use food or food products as a commodity, and you try and get economies of scale by maxing out that commodity. So you decide, I'm going to be into poultry farming or beef farming, and you try and maximize your output. You don't necessarily value elements of the input or the pollution you cause or the carbon emissions you produce or what you're doing in terms of soil improvement so that your agricultural land can become a carbon sink. So when we look at emissions, we don't ever see the balance sheet of really what's going on. And so what is a farmer doing to actually improve their soil so it can actually, become a sink? We don't see that. So from a point of view, what is an agroecological system? It's where you look at the entire ecosystem around agriculture. And what you're trying to do there is be as efficient and sustainable as possible. So you're trying to minimize your inputs and you're trying to optimize, not necessarily maximize your output. So your yield may be a little bit less, but it can be maintained forever and a day. It's a sustainable farming system. So it is basically the system that underpins organic in the real sense. It's great to see organizations like IFOAM, the Soil Association, have always been there. It's not called the Soil Association for nothing.
Yeah.
So it's all about the soil, this thin layer of our terrestrial ecosystem, for which most of it is currently used in agriculture, is being degraded at such a rapid rate that if we don't start paying attention to this and looking at the plants, the animals, and the microorganisms that make it up, we have a problem. And that's what's happened with industrial agriculture. It's very much a product of the Western mindset where we basically break everything down into compartments. And the reality is that we've had this system in operation since the Industrial Revolution. It's only been around a couple of 100 years, and we've pretty much decimated the planet because of it. So do we sort of maintain a plant-based way of eating, as, say, Eat Lancet is suggesting? This is the big 2-year study that's been done by the Eat Forum, combined with a number of experts, both in sustainability and in nutritional science. And it's kind of desk-based research. Many of us who've been more the, if you like, the at the coal face of agriculture will say, this doesn't make any sense. You know, we got marginal lands that can't be used for arable crops. What are we doing there? And actually having a livestock system within that is working alongside agroecological principles can be the most efficient way of doing it.
But look, it's a gross problem in education, though, right? So we were farming organically on a small holding, producing beef in what unfortunately became a terribly unsustainable way, because essentially I kind of sucked into this thing of subsidy-driven agriculture on a small enough farm that we could only really keep 11 breeding animals and their offspring in any one year. The sales quantity from the entire thing is like less than 20,000 euros. Like, it's like 11, 12,000 on a bad year. Yeah. And then, like, I'm seeing my neighbour's cattle, or my neighbour's grass, which is springing up earlier because he's spreading out his slurry, he's putting on NPK fertilizer, and we're all getting very jealous of the guy next door, and we're trying to do the organic thing. So where do you start in that system to intervene if you want to, change it, like without turning everyone vegan?
Well, basically, a mixed cropping farming system is the only system that really can exist, and it's a matter of scale. So it sounds like your problem was actually it's too small and it possibly wasn't diversified. Again, you were into beef farming, you weren't, and actually having a community farm system, this is one of the problems with land ownership as it's happened. It's led itself to large-scale industrial agriculture. Yeah. But actually, if you look at the sustainable agroecosystems, they are basically communities working together, looking at what is the optimum part of that environment. There will be parts of your land that actually may have been better for horticulture.
Yeah, and we did that, and it worked a bit better.
Yeah. So deciding that you're going to beef farm or dairy farm or without thinking about the agroecosystem that you're working in doesn't necessarily make sense.
So where do you start then to intervene, like to actually make changes, like without going back to the Stone Age in terms of agriculture? How are you going to convince farmers in Ireland, for instance, or farmers abroad in Europe, without looking at the types? I know the types of systems you're probably looking at from a sustainability point of view are in sub-Saharan Africa, that sort of area, where I don't know.
Those are the systems that I worked on, but as an academic, I was very much involved in sub-Saharan Africa, but I also worked on very large-scale cotton farming systems in Central Asia that were actually extraordinary. They were the largest scale, effectively organic but non-certified organic cotton systems, because they were putting huge amounts of pesticides in up until the 1980s, and then they built a kind of natural system with lucerne intercrops, and they had biocontrol factories and releasing different natural enemies into the farming system. Wow. And suddenly you could see a system that had evolved behind the Iron Curtain that was sustainable with cotton. And my professor from Imperial College, the world expert in cotton pest management, we went out there together, and when he saw it with his eyes, he said, I didn't realize this was possible. Wow. And it was working at scale. It's the fourth largest cotton producing place in the world, but the agrochemical companies wanted to see the system fail so that they could actually start using pesticides. Yes, so I mean, agroecological principles don't necessarily mean that you have to be certified organic. It's I think that the focus is really on the soil, and there are outfits like Soil and More that have developed a whole series of tools. I would say that's the starting point. The starting point is looking at your soil, really understanding your soil, to understand your agroecosystem to find out what is the best things to grow there or to cultivate. If you look at community farming systems, so this is moving more to a sort of regional approach, it's a question, and this is what we always used to do, is we will divide up labor and resources to make the best use of the land, but sustainability has to underpin it. Why? Because if it's not sustainable, you will deplete your soil and you won't be able to feed your grandkids.
Yes.
So, you know, sooner or later you've got to come to grips with this, and it's not about going backwards, it's about going forwards.
Yes.
So you know, I'd look at what Soil and More are doing as an outfit around the world. They have tools that farmers can use that really help them to understand their soil. If you think of soil improvement as the starting point, everything else you can build like building a house with solid foundations.
Can you go on?
I just want you to explain a little bit more for those of us who don't come from, say, a farming background, who don't understand what the message that I keep getting from people who are really hardcore vegans is that they're saying that it takes so much water, so much energy to sustain animals that half the world is starving, and if we just got rid of the animals and just focused on crops, we'd be able to feed all the planet and it would be so great.
Yeah.
So is what you're saying that we need to produce less animals or none or only animals?
Yeah,
or keep it
those data essentially come from industrial farming systems, particularly beef farming systems, and absolutely it is the most extraordinary inefficient system. So you are, if you like, flattening areas of the Amazon rainforest, you're growing your soya there, you're taking maize from North America, you're then shipping it across to Europe so that you can give your livestock foods that they have not evolved to consume. The amount of energy in that process, and then obviously if you look overall at emissions versus, you know, sequestration, it's a nightmare. But that's an industrial beef farming system. Doesn't look so great for pig farming either, but there are plenty of examples of agroecological beef farming and agroecological poultry and pig farming. Same thing applies to fish farming. You know, we are damaging our environment with the intensiveness or the intensity of our fish farming systems, and there are ways of doing fish farming. We can't all eat fish from the oceans anymore, but we can do it in a more sustainable manner. So yes, those data don't look good at all, but that doesn't mean that we can tar all forms of beef farming or, you know, pork farming with the same brush. We can't, and there's plenty of examples of it being done really sustainably.
And so why, like, if the choice is factory farming or everyone turns vegan, then everyone turns vegan.
Well,
but this is like a third way,
yeah.
is it?
Well, you could. So let's look at an example of what would happen if everyone went vegan. What would we do with the land? So we've got this huge amount of our terrestrial ecosystem that's taken up with agricultural land. We could plant trees on it. From a carbon sequestration point of view, it's a great thing to do. And obviously we can move into silviculture and agroforestry. Really, that's a great thing to do, and we should be doing a whole lot more of it. However, the reality is that if you look around the world at the places where the problem is at its greatest, and of course, you know, China will sit at any list that you look at in terms of carbon emissions. Then you've got places like Russia. We're also going to be experiencing the fastest population growth in sub-Saharan Africa in the next 30 years. I mean, I've spent a lot of time, I was born in East Africa and spent a lot of time working in Africa. The relationship between prosperity and meat eating is something that's not going to suddenly disappear.
Right.
The vegan consciousness that's driving the trend at the moment is not something I think that will catch on in a big way in China or sub-Saharan Africa or in Russia. It's a
reflection of a society that's disconnected from its food source in a big way, isn't it?
I believe so, and I think obviously you have to measure up the animal welfare side of it. Any kind of factory or industrial farming system is not going to be kind to animals. That needs to change. You know, one of the things I talked about yesterday was really trying to understand what is different between animals and plants, to say from an ethical point of view, because we've got environmental issues, we've got human health issues, and then we've got a whole ethics question around it as well. And I feel very passionately about this, that in many respects, plants are just slow animals. You know, I mean, they really are. They have this extraordinary defense system that has been built up because they are sessile. They're stuck in the ground there. They've got to have complex defense systems. What we see from a health point of view is when people transition to a vegan diet, and particularly when they start putting vast quantities of plants into juices and consuming it, we start to see the body going, do you know what? I don't understand all this chemistry that you're putting inside me because it's too much. The signals are too great. And that can start to create, we're seeing now a lot of people young people who've turned to veganism starting to experience, you know, digestive problems, intolerance problems. We see more autoimmune disease where the body cannot distinguish between self and non-self.
That's an interesting one, because that's an argument that comes up a lot, and people say, well, look, where are the studies? Are there studies that are really showing that on a broad scale that we're seeing that?
They are. It's more clinical data. So the one of the things that's happening clinically is that we're seeing, from a dietary point of view, the kind of diet that helps people to get out of that is a carnivore diet. And so carnivore diets are now becoming really popular. There is no evidence in my book that this is a great long-term diet, but taking the plant signals out of the equation for a period, it may be a 3-month period, and then slowly reintroducing them, often at a lesser dose, can actually resolve all the associated problems.
Go on.
So, I know that loads of the people who I talk to who are really into veganism, they look at people who promote the vegan message and who are really muscly and really fit and full of life and jumping around the place, and they go, well, but they look great and they're having a great time and they're causing very little harm. You were saying that it's going into their bodies and it's causing digestive issues. How come they're having such a great time?
Well, first of all, it's not necessarily representative of all people. So there have been a number of very outspoken vegan influencers who've actually had to put their hand up and said, you know what, guys, I've reintroduced some meat into my life.
Any names?
Do you know what? I'm not great at influencers.
Okay.
I'm so sorry about that.
That's
I'm
right.
sure you
We'll
can flash
put
them
them
up
into
on the
the show
screen.
notes.
Yeah. No, I mean, our team has been following quite a few of these people who've changed their mind. What we're seeing, because we're very closely aligned to practitioner associations, a huge influx over the last 3 years of people who are coming in with these digestive issues, and also we're seeing around the world, particularly in the States, the growth of the carnivore movement. So if you look at the LCHF, the low carb, high fat clinicians who are using it for diabetes control, they have seen often people who have been on vegan diets resolve issues. You know, anyone who's a vegan, generally speaking, you know, on average, the carbohydrates as a proportion of total energy intake is often somewhere around 55 to 60%. So it's difficult. It can be very useful to start increasing your fat. One of the most dangerous things you can do is keep your fat intake very low and be a vegan. I mean, you're really not getting enough healthy fats. And of course, there are, I passionately believe you can be a healthy vegan, but you need to be a wise vegan. And in fact, Mel and I have just recently written a book called Vegan Adventure that's going to be out shortly as an ebook. That's all about looking at all the different aspects of veganism that you can actually are within your control, but you have to understand lectins, and you have to understand oxalates and histamines, and you have to understand some of the plant chemistry that you need to get right. You have to be looking at your response to those foods and really be very, very aware.
So what's your message then in terms of like volume of meat consumption, when, how much, what type? What do you have sort of fairly structured recommendations at this stage, or is it just questions?
No, our Food for Health guidelines have certainly suggestions that you know, depending again on your age and also how much physical activity you're taking probably around about 20 to 25% of total energy from protein. Now, if you decide to get all of that from plants, you're going to struggle unless you're taking, a plant protein isolate. If you look at the development of cell-based agriculture, which is, if you like, lab-grown meats, you take stem cells from.
Sorry, just to clarify about that.
Okay.
You're talking about like vegan burger things, is it?
But it's
No,
muscle.
It's creating muscle in a test tube, essentially, in a petri dish. So you're taking a stem cell from an animal, and that stem cell is then being grown into muscle fiber. Now, the reality is, if you look at healthy meats, they aren't just lean muscle. Some of the healthiest pasture-fed animals you're actually eating marble meats. So if you look at the saturated fatty acid profile in those marble meats, that is actually very good for the human body, assuming that the animal hasn't been fed full of hormones and medications, etc. And so if we look at the profile and we look at the minerals of a pasture-fed animal, that's why people often who start reintroducing that kind of meat into their diet start to feel much better. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean red meat. There's very strong epidemiological evidence, studies from human population saying that red meat will increase your all-cause mortality, more heart attacks, more stroke, more cancer. Those data are based on factory farming systems. Okay, and also there's plenty of data just to suggest also we do so much damage, not only how we raise the animals, it's also how we cook the meat. So there's very clear evidence that say the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the chemicals that form when you singe your meat, and you can then cross-link your sugars, because we're now putting so much sugar into our savory foods, particularly if you eat out. And that's another thing, that at no time in our history have people had so many takeout meals. I mean, people are eating more and more meals away from their home that have a whole bunch of things, including sugar. And then we want everything blackened. When we blacken our foods, we know that we create a whole bunch of carcinogens. So you've got all these confounding factors that get in the way of the data. So, when you see red meat is a problem, you're actually looking at people eating a bunch of overcooked hamburgers, because that's what they're eating when they're out there. They're not eating, beautiful steaks that are lightly cooked from a grass-fed animal.
And why is it then that the science is so conflicted? Because what you're saying sounds just like uber simple and like very straightforward and like black and white. Why is it then that the studies that come out that show that veganism is the way to go, is it like, what's the agenda? Why are people not able to find out the real truth of this thing?
There is no such thing as a truth, and I hope I wasn't making out that the science is really just black and white.
Okay.
Essentially, we have limited data on the whole picture, and it's that paucity of data that actually allows so many competing views to exist. So we all come in there with our biases and our own opinions, but at some time you've got to try and understand where is the empirical data. And in my view, the empirical data in farming is on the land, and the empirical data in health is in the clinic. And so we spend a lot of time looking at what's happening there. Now, you talk to any farmer who's, basically rearing animals on marginal lands, they'll say, well, you want to grow arable crops here, you want to grow vegetables, forget it. This is my livelihood, this is what my family's been doing for centuries, and it's a sustainable system. And if you look at clinics, that's when I was talking to you about some of the health problems that we're beginning to see. This is a rapid change. I mean, the escalation of autoimmune diseases is happening very quickly. A lot of it's got to do with industrial food production systems. That's from how you grow the plants. I mean, many people believe that, hydroponics is the way to go. I don't believe it, because I believe you have to look at the soil as the fundamental substrate on this thin layer we have around the land on our planet. We've got to look after that. A plant that grows in a hydroponic system can never have the full association with microorganisms with minerals that it would have if it was growing in a living soil. And of course, the living soil is not just a place that grows the plants or supports livestock. It is a really important part of the ecosystem for nutrient cycling. It's no surprise that if you want to have a really healthy vegetable crop, it's difficult to do it without putting pee and poop from animals into the system.
Yeah.
Animals are always part of the system if you're going to have a really healthy, viable system.
Yeah, so talk about that a little bit, because I know there's some interesting research around what large grazing herds used to do in the past, and can you speak to how that affected soil and why that's such a necessary thing?
The Alan Savory approach, which is contested by some people,
Okay.
but I mean there is no doubt that large herds of grazing animals were able to understand how they could manage an ecosystem. I mean, humans are not great we're not great at managing ecosystems, essentially because we don't have to. We always look for a technological solution, and it's a bit like, now we're starting to really understand, yes, we've got a problem with carbon emissions. How are we going to sequester more carbon? So most of the solutions that we're looking at are about how business interests can find a way of grabbing that carbon out of the air, or, believe it or not, push it further down in the bottom of oil wells so we can get more oil up, and it's a cheaper way of getting oil out to produce even more emissions. But we're generally looking at a technological solution that will benefit, one industrial partner or another, and that's not the way ecology works. Ecology is this fluid interplay between different living organisms. It's about trying to make sure that the next generation are able to survive. So, if you like, sustainability is built into the DNA of animals and plants. We're the one species that seems to disregard it. Look what we're doing to our planet. Look what we're doing to our health. I think the convergence of this dual problem with human health, all these preventable diseases that we are creating, combined with an environmental crisis of lack of biodiversity, excessive carbon emissions and greenhouse climate change effects, is actually a wake-up call for many people. And
it's a very strong line.
and I don't think there will be a magical technological solution. Technology will help us understand the problem, but the solution is actually working with nature, not against it.
Yeah, because the instinct is with 11 years to stop heating the planet up. That's kind of, and that's conservative, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's
1.5.
thing.
Yeah, 1.5 degree shift. Yeah, it's.
So, is it feasible my instinct is to reach for technology in that situation. Is it feasible to make the sorts of reversals you're talking about in terms of agricultural methods in 11 years?
The bottom line is it would be just about feasible from what I can gather from experts working in that area. The fact is that no one is moving quick enough, and that's Greta Thunberg's complaint, and she gets nice applauses, and no one is moving fast enough to do that, and we've got to be simultaneously engaging in massive tree planting operations. We've got to see a sea change in the way that we produce food. I still believe the public can do a lot. I mean, in the Western world, there is a desire, and I think, if you like, the interest in veganism is part of that change. But if we continue to go down the factory farming, industrial farming route, I think we won't make it. From a human health point of view, I think we still won't be that healthy. From an environmental point of view, if we don't start improving our soils, we're not going to make it either. And just a switch to veganism does not necessarily prioritize soil improvement. So within the Eat Lancer report, there is no direct reference to transitioning to an agroecological approach. That, I believe, is the heart of the solution.
And what is the Eat Lancer report telling us to do?
To massively reduce our meat eating, particularly our red meat eating, to increase the amount of, it is the Walter Willett nutritional solutions has been on the table for the last 30 or 40 years, with some nice science around it.
No flesh.
Yeah, it's got, they issued a 46-page study. I think we were the first to come back with a comprehensive response, we've seen what we consider to be some serious flaws in the thinking, and this comes from the fact that the solution is a global solution, whereas it needs to be, if it's going to be an agroecological solution, it needs to be considered in the context of the different biogeographical areas of the world that you're dealing with, and you've got to take into account the politics, the economics, the geopolitics, consumer interest, behavior, culture. It's a very, very complex picture, and just believing that you can magically do it by taking livestock out of your system is not the solution in my view.
Okay, so what, with that in mind, what is the step for people to be able to take for you? And have you seen places in the Western world where that is beginning to happen, where people can take steps to actually improve and go in the direction that you are proposing?
I think one of the most exciting trends is actually the development of the real food and regional food movement, where people are wanting to get food not so much from a supermarket, but as close as possible to the farm gate. They've realized that supermarkets are about industrial farming, and they see huge amounts of air miles on these products, and they don't have an understanding of the full supply chain or provenance. People are wanting to eat food that is, probably doesn't have a barcode on it so much. That is I think that's the beginning of change.
I think it's a really exciting thing. I think there's been that, and the other thing that's been really exciting is that people are this emphasis on craft production, which sort of came from nowhere.
Yeah.
Like, it's a weird instinct. It sort of feels like that's the instinct we've had that's correct. That came from nowhere. That's become, like, it's become trendy, which is the most useful way to make it like virally like happen.
Yeah.
And it's happening at the sort of rate that makes, like, I mean, a lot of the products that are here, like Jamu, I'm looking at down there, like these products are produced locally that have like a sense of place to them.
Yeah.
A sense of, like, they're not looking to expand to go beyond a certain amount of production. You can't get more than your 30 bottles a week. Yeah. That's kind of where we need to be, isn't it?
Exactly. It's about steady state systems, stable systems, and they don't have to be on this continuous growth trajectory, which is what happens with, the globalization of the food supply is really part of the process of degrading that food supply.
Along with that kind of artisan movement, it's become this massive movement of like eating the animal
nose to tail,
and like all the offal meats and all of that kind of stuff. Is it possible to get those benefits from a vegan diet?
Yeah, is it possible to get all the nutrients as a vegan?
Yeah.
Because we've sort of come into it.
Yeah.
I think it is possible to get all the nutrients that your body needs as a vegan, but you're going to need to supplement as well. You're going to probably struggle with trying to balance your omega-6 to 3 ratio. You should try and get an omega-6 to 3 ratio which is less than 4 to 1. The average Western person is currently about 20 to 1. If you consume your ALA, your flaxseed oil that is giving you your ALA, your conversion to EPA and DHA is pretty low, and EPA in particular. So it's very, very difficult to do that without having some fish oils, for example, in the system. But you can take all of these things as supplements, and even if you're taking an ALA supplement or a microalgal supplement, you can take a lot of it in order to get what your body needs. You'll definitely be deficient in B12, but again, you can take B12 lozenges, 5,000 microgram lozenges, for example. Trying to get all your one-carbon metabolism nutrients that allow you to regenerate new cells in your gut, really important, so you need to have the right sort of B6, folate, B12 combination. Nucleotides are really important as well, so people who like eating offal meats do really well. That, in evolutionary terms, has been our primary supply of nucleotides, and nucleotides are the if you like, the outside spiral staircase of our DNA and RNA that we need every time we build new cells. We get vast amounts from offal meats, but also from fermented foods. So a vegan has to eat a lot of fermented foods to put more nucleotides in, but you can also get great supplement versions of nucleotides as well. And we need these nucleotides for cellular repair, for building new cells, and that really happens in our gut. We replace our gut lumen every 3 to 5 days, and we've also got this massive factory of bacteria there that are turning over all the time. While they make some key nutrients themselves, they also really benefit from the supply of additional nucleotides. So these, we can do it, but this is why I talk about this notion of being a wise vegan. You've got to really know what you're doing.
But it also sounds like if you're having to supplement that much, there's also a lot of production that goes into making
it doesn't
those
sound that
supplements,
sustainable
right?
at that
It
level.
doesn't feel like a sustainable option. It feels like you're taking in more businesses, more production, more air miles.
More consumption.
More
Well, look,
consumption.
you know, this is where you get. We touched on this idea of ethics before, and for me, as a scientist and an ecologist, I don't have the kind of distinct separation between plants and animals that some people have. I mentioned this idea that, you know, plants are really slow animals. So they don't have brains, they don't have eyes, they don't have ears, but they see, they smell, you know, they respond. So if they do all of those things, don't they feel? And I believe that plants do feel. And then, you know, well, why are we just choosing to eat plants and not animals? So it comes down to not only animal welfare, but plant welfare. If you imagine that the communication system that plants use is via the root rhizosphere, so this is these complex microbial communities that exist around the root systems, they can communicate to plants, you know, meters away from them. If they're stuck in a hydroponic system, they can't communicate. The other way they communicate is through space, through air. They release a whole lot of volatiles. They communicate with insects and other plants. So they are able to communicate. Why? Just because they don't have the central nervous system that's the same as the animals.
Yeah.
Why are they so distinct? So my view is we've got to respect all life. And that's why a complete ecological system comes with plants, animals, and microorganisms. The rest of nature is busy respectfully sharing itself with other parts of the system. Why can't we do the same?
Good point to finish.
Rob,
Yeah.
thank you so much for coming on. It's been great to chat to you. And yeah, we feel like we've got loads more questions, but we'll definitely revisit this maybe next year at this time and see where the conversations evolve to.
And if people want to find you, they go to ANHinternational.org.
And you're also on Instagram, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Reluctantly.
Yeah.
Somebody's not managing it on Instagram. Shameful. So this man is the busiest man in the universe. So he might take 2 months to get back to you, but he will get back to you, and it'll be the most comprehensive answer you ever experience in your life. So it is worth asking the question. Thanks again, Rob. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Finn.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Really.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
folks. Bye.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So
Merci,
there we
great.
go.